Yeah, again, hi, I'm Sarah Beth. I'm the new education manager here at the Delaware Center for Horticulture. I'm responsible for developing all of the adult and youth education programs, as well as overseeing the Branches to Chances Return to Work program. I'm a graduate of the Penn State University with a Bachelor of Science in Community, Environment, and Development and a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish. Presenting with me today is Heather Titanic. She is our community forester, and she has worked to maintain an equitable tree canopy throughout Delaware and Newcastle County through coordinating tree plantings, giveaways, and low-cost tree sales. She has a BS in Forest Resource and Environmental Conservation from Virginia Tech and is ISA certified arborist. And she has her tree risk assessment qualification. So before we get started with the presentation, just a quick few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube. Feel free to type up any questions you have in the Q&A. When the presentation is over, Heather and I will do our best to answer all of your questions. And thank you for joining us today. With all of that said, let's dive in. Today we're discussing Tu BiShvat, the Jewish New Year of the trees, and then Heather will talk to us about trees and their significance, and then we'll follow that up with the Q&A. Okay. So what is Tu BiShvat? Tu BiShvat is a Jewish holiday that literally translates to the 15th of Shabbat, which is the Hebrew month in which the holiday takes place. In Hebrew, each letter in the alphabet corresponds with a number. So 2 is 15 because it is comprised of the letters Tet, which is 9, and Vav, which is 6. Because Jewish holidays follow the Hebrew lunar calendar, all days start and end before sundown. So because in the Torah or the Old Testament, night was mentioned before day, night is considered the start of a new day. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, which is different from the solar calendar we're most accustomed to in the United States. This means that Jewish holidays follow the moon instead of the sun, so they rarely match up with the solar calendar dates that they fall on from year to year. Like Hanukkah and Tu BiShvat, they always seem to be changing when they're happening, and that's why. Tu BiShvat is commonly seen as the Jewish Earth Day, and the two do have a lot in common. However, Tu BiShvat also signifies an ancient connection with the land and a deep concern for the environment among Jewish people. So here's a quote from My Jewish Learning that signifies the importance for Jewish farmers in ancient times of Tu BiShvat. So the Torah states, when you enter the land of Israel and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years later, it shall be forbidden for you, not to be eaten. The fruit of the 4th year was to be offered to the priests in the temple as a gift of gratitude for the bounty of the land, and the 5th year fruit and all subsequent fruit was finally for the farmer. This law, however, raised the question of how farmers were to mark the birthday of a tree. The rabbis therefore established the 15th of the month of Shabbat as a general birthday for all trees, regardless of when they were actually planted. So a little bit more of history. Although Tu BiShvat has origins rooted in the Torah, the holiday was established in post-biblical times, similar to Hanukkah, and created by the rabbis of the 17th century. Some believe that this date held historical importance for planting trees in the Jewish faith, specifically marriage trees. Following your child's birth, you would plant a tree on Tu BiShvat for your newborn, cedar for the birth of boys, and cypress for the birth of girls. And then once they were set to be married, the branches from their marriage tree would be used for the chuppah, or their wedding canopy. And just a little fun fact, both cedars and some types of cypress are native to the Mediterranean region where Israel is located. And another type of cypress tree can be found all along the Atlantic coast, including here in Delaware. So how is Tu BiShvat celebrated today? As with many holidays, the traditions of today differ from those of the past. Today, many people celebrate this holiday in different ways, but there are still some common traditions embraced. One tradition is to eat fruit that is from Israel, such as almonds and other fruits and nuts. The 7 species, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates, are commonly eaten during this holiday as well. And you can see an image of them on the screen. And this tradition is often accompanied by a seder, which is essentially a service that takes place over the course of a meal. The most famous seder is the Passover one. Another tradition is to plant a tree in Israel. Israel is one of the only nations in the world with a net growth of trees. It's also become increasingly popular to plant trees where everyone lives as well, and not just in Israel, though this is more common in warmer regions where winter months aren't as intense as they are here. As time has progressed, this holiday has become more generally about conservation and caring for the environment. The lasting impact of Tu BiShvat. The Hebrew phrase "Lador Vador" means from generation to generation, and I think it ties in really well with this holiday because we're planting seeds not just for ourselves and for the earth, but also because we're investing in the future for those who will come after us. And another Hebrew phrase that ties in well with this holiday is tikkun olam, or repair the world. Growing up, my rabbi would often say that it isn't our job to fix the whole world, but if we can make one part of the world better, then we've done a mitzvah or a good deed. By continuing to care for the earth and creating a more sustainable world, we are engaging in tikkun olam and lador vador. And thank you. So with that, I will be passing on the presentation to Heather, who will talk more about trees and their significance. Heather?
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us today for your lunch, adding a little bit of green to your lunch on this nice cold winter day. As Sarah mentioned, I'm the community forester, and I'm so happy to be here talking about trees. I love talking about trees every day, but especially on days like today with such a strong cultural tie to tree stewardship and environmental care. So before we get into talking more about how we can celebrate this holiday and how we can do so here in Delaware, I just want to get us all on the same page. You know, most everybody has a fond childhood memory tied to a tree or a forest that you would visit with your family. But what is a tree, and how do we know that it's that we're looking at and talking about so fondly? So for starters, a tree is a woody plant that has one perennial stem that persists year round. We call this the trunk. That trunk is at least 3 inches in diameter at a point 4.5 feet above the ground, so just about at shoulder height. And trees also have a mature height of at least 13 feet. This is kind of a subjective number, but this is mostly to differentiate trees from shrubs. And lastly, trees put a lot of energy into maintaining their woody tissues, and they do this through 2 primary types of growth. Their primary growth is focused on resource acquisition. So trees are constantly growing taller from the ends of their shoots to get more access to sunlight so they can better photosynthesize and make more energy for themselves. And the secondary form of growth is focused on stability. So each year trees are putting more resources into growing their trunk wider and wider. And this is why when you cut down a tree at the end of its life, you can look inside and see the annual growth rings and count those to get the age of the tree. Next slide, please. So now that we know what a tree is, why do we want them? Especially in cities, space is a very expensive commodity. So why would we put all of the space and money towards planting and maintaining trees when it could go towards other means of community development? Well, it turns out that trees actually provide a lot of ecological and social benefits to us when we plant them and maintain them. First and foremost, trees are producing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Oxygen is pretty critical in our day-to-day lives, so we have trees to thank for that. As trees are also growing, they're really helping to combat climate change. So carbon is basically the building block of wood. So every time that the tree grows taller or wider, trees are sequestering carbon in their woody tissues above ground and below ground. Trees also act as giant umbrellas, especially when they leaf out in the spring. And this really helps to catch rainwater that gets held on their leaves to help evaporate or to slowly run down the stems. And this overall slows the rain from hitting the ground and helps to reduce stormwater runoff and flooding, which is really important in cities where we have miles of man-made impervious surfaces and lots of flooding issues. This umbrella-like canopy can also work to provide shade, which helps to cool the air and surface temperatures. And especially if you strategically plant trees, particularly on the south side of a structure or your house, this is going to really help to shade that hot afternoon sun. And this will help to reduce energy cost and use since you won't need to be running your air conditioning as much in the summer. This cooling effect is directly correlated to what we call the urban heat island effect. And this is what happens when we cut down trees, we pave over forests, and we develop and build cities. So this is a graph that shows the late afternoon temperature on the y-axis, which is compared to the changing land uses on the x-axis. So you can see as you go from rural to suburban to downtown areas, the temperature is drastically increasing in the summer. And this is another reason why it's so important that we plant trees and we maintain them so that they can grow to provide those benefits to us. In addition to environmental services, trees are also part of the larger ecosystem. So when we plant native trees, they typically flower in the spring, which then matures to fruit in the fall or late summer. And this provides food and habitat for native wildlife and also supports native pollinators. Throughout the year, trees also grow leaves, which they then fall off in autumn. And as these leaves decompose, they add nutrients back into the soil, almost acting like a slow release fertilizer. And as the trees are growing taller and wider above ground, they're also putting a great deal of resources into their below ground root system, which in turn helps to stabilize soil. And this can be particularly important along stream banks or in areas of high erosion. So in addition to environmental and ecosystem services, trees also provide a great deal of social services to us, and these have been pretty widely studied. We've found that within neighborhoods with a mature, well-maintained tree canopy, people are more inclined to spend time outside, they're more likely to talk with their neighbors and instill a greater sense of community pride and civic pride. And there's also a pretty strong correlation between neighborhoods with increased tree canopy cover having significantly lower crime rates. These correlations between urban greening and the benefits to human health have been really widely studied. And so up here are a few salient points of the more popular studies that really help to drive urban greening practices today. So we know that people living near green space have less mental distress, are more physically active, and tend to have longer lifespans. When people exercise outdoors in natural environments, they tend to do so for longer and at greater intensities. And lastly, one of the most widely known studies is that hospital patients with a natural view or even a photo of a natural view in their room tend to have quicker recovery times and use fewer pain medications than hospital patients who either don't have a window that looks out onto a parking lot, or they don't have a photo of green space in their hospital room. To really drive home the importance of protecting and planting trees in city, this is a graph that shows the population projected through 2050. You can see that as the world becomes increasingly more populated, significantly more people are expected to reside in cities and suburbs compared to rural areas. And this contributes to increased development, tree loss, and that urban heat island effect that we talked about earlier. So we're here on this nice winter day to celebrate Tu BiShvat. This year, this falls in February. And I strongly believe that Arbor Day is every day. So some ways that you can continue celebrating Arbor Day or celebrate the earth in winter. Yes, you can plant a tree. Anytime during the dormant season when the ground isn't frozen and you're willing to get out there and start digging and get your hands in the dirt is a great time to plant the tree. But if you're not wanting to roll up your sleeves in the cold, that's totally understandable. You can also get outside and go on winter tree ID walks to start to learn more about tree form, and especially evergreen trees. This is a great time to focus on evergreens. Winter is their time to shine and learn some of their characteristics. Winter is also the best time for pruning because there are less fungal and bacterial populations just out when it's colder. So trees have a better success rate for healing from pruning wounds. And winter is also great to stay nice and cozy inside and start planning for your spring plantings. So while you're planning for your spring garden, you can incorporate principles of Tu BiShvat and continue celebrating fruit trees with some of these native trees here that are found in Delaware. So you could plant a serviceberry, which has beautiful white flowers in the spring that mature to those purplish red berries in the summer. It's also known as Juneberry because these berries appear in June in the summer. Pawpaw trees are another great native fruit tree. They typically are found in the understory of forests and they grow in colonies. So if you do plant a pawpaw, you're going to want to give them some space to grow horizontally, across the ground. And you're also going to want to plant at least 2 separate trees because they do need cross-pollination to produce the fruit. But if you have that cross-pollination and you wait a few years, you will start to see pawpaw fruits, which are kind of like a mango mixed with a banana. And they ripen in late summer around September. Lastly, persimmons are another great fruit tree. These are a taller shade tree, and they have a beautiful yellowish orange fall color, which is followed by the fruit, which ripens just around the first frost, and are, small sweet berries. These are different than the persimmons you'll see in grocery stores. Those tend to be the Asian persimmons, I think of Japanese descent. And so the native persimmons tend to be a bit smaller, but just as delicious. As Sarah mentioned earlier, there is a cypress tree native to the eastern United States, and this is the bald cypress. This tree is pretty unique in that it's a deciduous conifer, so it bears cones like its distant relatives, pine trees, but it loses its needles every fall, which results in a beautiful orange fall color that you see here. This tree is pretty large, so if you do plant a bald cypress, give it some space above ground and below ground. They can grow, typically you'll see them about 50 to 70 feet tall. Occasionally they'll grow over 100 to 120 feet tall, but that is much more common in wetlands and further south where it's a warmer, wetter climate. And these are really long-lived trees. So again, we're planting for the future. So if you plant a bald cypress, just know that that bald cypress may still be there up to 600 years later. Bald cypress are a water-loving species, and so they do best in coastal areas or wetland areas, or even just areas that have, that are inundated with water regularly. But they are pretty tolerant of many soil types, and they can even be planted as a street tree if you have the space for it. A distinct feature of this tree is the knobby knees that you see there on the right. And these are commonly seen around the base of wetland plants. The jury is still out on why wetland plants can produce these knees, but we think it's to help with aeration and the stability of the tree's root system in such wet areas. And lastly, the cedar of Lebanon. You can't talk about Tu BiShvat and the Jewish Arbor Day without talking about the cedar of Lebanon. So this is a non-native tree, as its name implies. It's native to the mountains of Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And this is another really large tree. So it'll grow to about 70 feet tall in cultivation, in yards and parks. And occasionally you'll find it growing up to 120 feet tall. Here it's pictured in, I believe, Lebanon. So long-lived, tall trees. Again, we're planting for the future. And as it gets older, the cedar of Lebanon has a really distinct form. It grows these very horizontally spreading branches. So you can almost identify it as you're driving by them, these really old, mature trees with horizontal lines for the branches. Here's some more photos of mature cedar of Lebanons. You can just really see that they're very flat top trees. When you ask a kid to draw a coniferous tree, typically there's going to be a point at the top, and that's not quite the case with cedar of Lebanon, especially as you see it as it's more mature and later in life. So we continue celebrating Arbor Day every day. You can join us for some upcoming forestry events. So we will be having a winter pruning lecture this Saturday at the Delaware Center for Horticulture. That will be followed by a winter tree ID walk in March. And then lastly, this April, as you start planning for your spring planting, keep us in mind because we will be having a low-cost tree sale on the second Saturday of April, April 8th. Thank you again for joining us for your lunch. Now we will take it over to a Q&A. And any questions that we don't end up getting to, you can feel free to reach out to either Sarah or myself. And the Delaware Center for Horticulture, for those of you who may not be familiar, we are a membership-based organization. So you can go to our website at thedch.org to learn more about our work, upcoming events, and how to become a member to continue supporting us.
Okay, great. So I see some questions are coming in through the Q&A. Feel free to keep them coming and we'll get through as many as we can. Here's a question from Vic. Oh, just kidding. Here's a question from Jennifer. On a tree ID walk, is there an app that you can recommend to help identify what we are seeing?
That's a great question and one that I commonly get. Plant ID apps are good at best. I think a lot of times it's hard to capture the identification of a tree in one feature of it. So it's hard to know what tree is by just looking at the leaf. You often need to look at leaves, fruit, flower, form, and bark. So it's hard to capture that all in one app or in one photo. But that being said, Seek is an app that I use sometimes if I'm unsure about plant identification, and I use them more as a starting point. So it'll often give you either a genus or sometimes a genus and species of what it thinks it is. And so taking that with the power of Google tends to get you pretty close to what you're looking at. And in terms of online resources, once you have an idea of what it is, Virginia Tech Dendrology, I am very impartial to them because I am a graduate of Virginia Tech and I went through their forestry department, but they have a really great online resource for keying out trees once you kind of know what you're looking at.
Okay. Someone asked, can we grow Lebanon cedars in Delaware?
You can if you're very patient. They are slow growing trees, but like I said, they can live for up to 600 years. So if you're really patient and you're planting them for your great grandchildren, you can. There are a few here in Wilmington. One, I see Susan put it in the Q&A. There are some growing at Congregation Beth Emeth. And there are a few others scattered throughout Wilmington, but you really need a lot of space for it. But you can grow them in Wilmington.
Michael asks, what tree would be good for a smaller front yard, preferably one that does not require too much care and would grow no more than 20 to 25 feet?
Yeah, so there are a few smaller trees. I mentioned the serviceberry earlier. That's a pretty small tree. They grow a height of about 25 feet over time, and they will produce white flowers in the spring. They'll leaf out, provide some decent shade throughout the summer, and then you'll have some nice berries if you're interested in that. Eastern redbud also comes to mind. They are another small flowering tree that is actually pictured here. We planted this at Mount Zion, which is a historic cemetery here in Wilmington. Eastern redbuds grow to about 35 feet over time, but are also smaller in terms of trees. And in terms of maintenance, all trees, once you plant them, should be watered weekly for the first 2 years of their life. But in terms of other gardening or plant care, trees are very low maintenance. So if you're planting a garden, you need to maintain that every year, pretty much forever. But if you plant a tree, you need to maintain it more intensely in the first few years of its life, and then they're pretty self-sufficient, with some selective pruning here and there. If you want to join our pruning lecture this weekend to learn more about that, you're more than welcome to. But trees are pretty low maintenance overall, but they do need that first 2 to 3 years of watering.
And I just want to add on to that really quickly that if you're interested in coming to our pruning event later this week, that you can sign up to be a member on our website and get a discounted event ticket for that and for all of our events. And any information for all of our events and membership is on our website. So Claire has a question. Do you have any books that you would recommend to learn more about trees, their benefits, and how to take care of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd recommend going to the ISA, which is the International Society of Arboriculture. They set the standards for urban forestry and arboriculture throughout the world. So proper tree planting, tree pruning, maintenance, and benefits, and look and see if they're offering any books. There's also a lot of really great webinars out there. I know the USDA, the US Forest Service, offers webinars, and I think they're mostly all recorded and online. And the Delaware Forest Service also has recorded webinars on their website.
Great. Susan asked, what's a good shrub or tree about 5 to 6 feet tall that can be used to screen from my backyard neighbors, shade to partial shade?
That's a good question. So if you go back to one of our earlier slides, a tree is typically one that's about 13 feet tall. So that may be more in the shrub category. For that, if you did want to go for a tree, a sweet bay magnolia may work. They're semi-evergreen with more of an open canopy, but they tend to be multi-stemmed, and you can prune them to keep them a bit smaller and more on the shrub side. There are some juniper varieties out there that you might be interested in. Susan, I know you have my contact information, so we can talk more about junipers, and maybe some dwarf junipers would be appropriate there.
Claire asks, are there any small trees that could be grown in pots or planters?
Yeah, so putting a tree in a pot or planter kind of limits, its lifespan. So you really want to think about how big is the pot, how much space do you have. You always want to give trees as much space as you can, because you can imagine a tree expects to grow in a forest with all this space underground and below and above ground for their roots and their branches. So smaller trees in pots are going to limit their growth and may eventually break the pot. So just to keep that in mind. But you can put some trees in pots. So river birch is one that comes to mind, is often used in containers, as well as I've seen sweet bay magnolias in containers. So ironically, trees that are native to wetland areas tend to be pretty good for urban tree plantings and, containerized tree plantings, because if they're native to wetland areas, they're used to inundated soils that are wetter and have low oxygen content. And so that often translates to them being able to survive well in urban environments, which may not be flooded all the time, but they're low oxygen, usually poor drainage. So river birch and sweet bay magnolia come to mind for container trees.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, feel free to reach out to Heather or myself with any questions. You can reach us by our emails as listed in the presentation, or feel free to find our contact information in the website as well under the Who We Are tab. Thank you so much for joining us here today and spending your lunch with us. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.